one of the biggest rivalries of the 80s was between this car and the BMW E30 M3, both on the track and off. Now, I already reviewed one of these about a year ago, a 2.5 16 valve, but that car had an automatic torque converter gearbox, which made a direct comparison quite difficult. There's a very big difference with this car though that you'll notice. It's a manual, hallelujah! There's no doubt that the 190 is less focused than the BMW M3, but where it scores over that car is in its handling balance, which is a little bit sweeter and more approachable for the average driver. There's also a few other aces that this has up its sleeve. Firstly, rather than a standard mechanical limited slip diff, this one is electronically activated. There's a real advantage to that. On a normal limited slip diff, there is some action going on there all the time. That means that the wheels, the diff is never fully open. That makes it slightly less wieldy and less happy to turn in. With this, it acts like an open diff at all times until traction is lost. Then it comes in to help with that. But that means that it has a more natural feeling when turning into corners. The M3 has semi-trailing arm rear suspension, and that's not a bad setup. But what happens during suspension travel is that the camber changes, the rear geometry changes. So that makes the car a little bit snappier, sometimes a bit more unpredictable. This has a multi-link rear suspension, which was super advanced for the time, and keeps the contact patch of the tyre parallel to the road better than the BMW setup. And lastly, Mercedes really put this through its paces. They ran it for 8 days continuously at the Nardo test track. Average speed 154 miles an hour. I'm not sure if the BMW would be able to match that. It was tricky to get the best out of the last one because of that auto gearbox, but today I'll be able to give you a final verdict. The standard 190, the 2.3, only had 134 horsepower. So Mercedes turned to Cosworth, who re-engineered the head, even changing from a 2-valve to a 4-valve per cylinder format. They managed to get 185 horsepower out of it. The 2.5, like this one, has another 10 horsepower. It was more about the torque. Let's see how it feels. It's a really sweet little engine, and what a contrast to the one in the M3, which is quite gruff, quite rough. This is as close as I think you will get to the civility of a 6-cylinder. It's so smooth. It's got a lovely sort of engine note as well. It doesn't have much low down, and bear in mind this is the 2.5, so already they re-engineered it because the 2.3 was considered too peaky for Mercedes' wish to make this a good all-round car. So it is more drivable than the first cars, but all the same, it is not blessed with a huge amount of torque. Doesn't matter though. Already just having that manual gear change gives me so much more confidence than in the previous car. I just feel more in control of it. The steering, as before, is so nice. It's not a particularly quick setup, and although it has, just getting confused with the dog leg there, that is 4th and 5th. And although it has a sports steering wheel, it's still massive. I don't know how much bigger the original, the ones on the standard cars would have been. It's not that direct, but it's still nice. You get lots of feedback, and it's keen and sweet on the turn-in as well. Plus, of course, it rides so well. It rides better than any modern AMG. I'd say it rides better than any modern Mercedes, full stop. I just don't understand why modern cars have to be so stiffly sprung. We'll see if there's a price to pay in a moment when it comes to the handling. Now, something else worth knowing about these is that they struggled to sell them really in large numbers because they were just so expensive. They were the same price or more expensive than a base S-Class. For such a small car, that was a big thing. And it's not like you got that much more for it. So especially if you look at the interior, there's hardly any difference from the standard cars. We've already talked about the sports steering wheel, which isn't really sporty at all. But also you get another little cluster of instruments at the bottom there, and the sports seats, which are more hugging. Really weirdly, at the back, they've got profiled seats as well. We'll talk about those more in a moment. We're on the tighter bend, so I'm keen to see how it feels. The gear change is a little bit tricky on this, and it's odd because it's the same as on the BMW, but it's lovely. The engine is so willing. Not a huge overabundance of power, but I think it's so well matched to what grip the car can offer, especially at this time of year when it's a little bit slimy out there. It's an absolute pleasure. I'm really loving this. Let's do another run through the gears, then we'll go quickly, and then I'll tell you some more of the other stuff. Four to 6.5 is the sweet spot, maybe to 7 even. It is a revvy engine, and the gearbox is quite obstructive, which is so odd because it's pretty nice on the BMW, a little bit notchy perhaps, but it must all come down to the linkages that Mercedes have used. But it's a car that feels innately right, and although it rides so well, it doesn't really lean that much, and it communicates exactly what it's doing. It's so benign. You know what it's going to do, and even when it loses traction, it doesn't feel scary at all. That was just, a friendly little nod. Now, it has a really interesting story, this 190, because originally Mercedes developed it to win the World Rally Championship. It had independent rear suspension, rear-wheel drive, it was light, so everything looked like it was perfect. But then the Audi Quattro came out, and four-wheel drive made this instantly irrelevant. Now, while they were deciding what they were going to do about that, they ran a one-make series. I think it was called Past Masters, or included Past Masters, but it was basically people like Sterling Moss racing against current drivers like Prost. And the whole series was actually won by Senna, who at that time wasn't that well known. And you can see him drifting it around the place. And even then, the lean, the angles of lean are pretty impressive. But because it's got that really trick rear suspension, it doesn't suffer too much from lack of grip because of it. Now, because it can absorb the bumps, it feels incredibly sure-footed for a two-wheel drive car on this kind of road at this time of the year. It means you can kind of relax with it a little bit when you're driving it. It's a friendly feeling car. And the other thing, of course, is that they are still, compared to M3s, incredible values. They're about a half, maybe even a third of the price. The tricky thing is finding a manual. There are a lot of autos. I think it's because it was a Mercedes, but really to appreciate it to its fullest, you do need to have a manual version. As well as that trick rear diff, there's something else about this car which is a little bit odd, and that is that Mercedes elected to send them out as standard with self-leveling rear suspension. Most of them by now have been converted to just a standard shock arrangement because it's complex and expensive to fix. This one was actually done, I think redone about 9 years ago, so this is it feels completely standard, this car. It was an odd choice to make because on a performance car, self-leveling rear suspension, really? But it seemed that Mercedes were absolutely intent on making this everyday usable. There's really very few compromises with a standard 190. And if you have a look at the back with the way those rear seats are reprofiled, which I've never seen in any other car, again, they intended this to be used, to be driven quickly with people on board. And I think that that last thought is a good way to try and frame the comparison between this and the M3. In terms of ultimate sharpness, of course, the E30 has it. But I think for many normal people, this is the better choice. It's just, I think you can exploit the performance on this without being as good a driver as to have to get the most out of the M3. It is also everyday usable in a way that the E30 isn't. You could literally buy one of these and use it every day. The owner of this, Johnny, still does. But one of the things that does affect these is the dreaded rust. This particular car has had an all-over restoration by Jason, the humble paint sprayer. I'll put his details up there and in the video description. It seems like he's done a lovely job with this car. But yeah, this gets used all the time. And it's survived, all in all, remarkably well. There's a few little signs of water ingress here, so a couple of the instruments have some condensation. I think it was parked outside for a while, maybe some water got in. But apart from that, that Teutonic build quality is still very much there. And I love the fact that you can get a performance car that doesn't ride like a skateboard. There's a tiny bit of underlying firmness here, but it's not at all unpleasant. The last time I drove one of these, even though it was the Auto, I concluded that they are an incredible bargain out there. It must be one of the last ones left from the 80s, which is still such good value if you compare it to its peers. I'm still not 100% sure why they're worth so much less than the equivalent M3. I think in part it's its less focused nature, but I think even more than that, it's just that they look so similar to the standard cars. This one additionally has some wheels that come from a later car, but with the gully decals, they're a little bit wider perhaps, but the design's the same, so you don't get much differentiation. That can only be it, because to drive, they are absolutely fantastic. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you to Johnny for bringing it down. If you're thinking of buying a car like this, I would definitely have a look at one. Thank you. See you soon.